Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Great Rift, Dick Cheney, Colin Powell, and the Broken Friendship That Defined an Era, by James Mann, narrated by Joe Barrett. Preface. He was at the time merely one of the American military's up-and-coming officers, a young general who had distinguished himself more for his talents in Washington than through commands in the field. Still, when General Colin L. Powell rose to deliver a speech at the Army War College in Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, on May 16, 1989, he carried with him an unusual authority, conveyed by his having recently taken part in civilian events of surpassing importance. Officially, Powell was the commander of U.S. Forces Command, which is responsible for all the U.S. troops stationed inside the United States. The post was less prominent than those of American commanders responsible for, say, the Middle East or Asia, but this job was merely a temporary placeholder for a rising star. During the previous 2 years, Powell had served as the National Security Advisor to President Ronald Reagan after having risen through a series of ever more important administrative jobs at the Pentagon and in the White House. He had played a leading role in organizing 3 summit meetings between Reagan and the Soviet leader Mikhail S. Gorbachev. Now it was assumed he was in line to fill a more exalted military post, such as Army Chief of Staff. He was one of the few U.S. military leaders, if not the only one, who swapped friendly personal notes with ex-presidents, sitting presidents, and their wives. In that spring of 1989, the world was in flux, in a way that seemed to benefit the United States. During Reagan's final 6 weeks in office, Gorbachev had given a far-reaching speech to the United Nations in which he announced that the Soviet Union would cut the size of its armed forces by 500,000 troops, and that in the process it would withdraw 6 armored divisions from Eastern Europe. Gorbachev had said that the countries there could determine their own destinies. Thus, the Soviet Union was forswearing the right to intervene at will in the affairs of its neighbors. With that speech, Gorbachev had gone beyond the mere rhetoric of change in Soviet foreign policy and had given substance to his words. It was now possible to imagine that after more than 4 decades, the Cold War might draw to a close. Powell's message at Carlisle that day was that it was time for America to begin thinking about what would come next. He rejected the idea that Gorbachev's new policies were reversible. Though the old Soviet bear may be dying, Powell told the audience, he's still a very formidable bear, and that we must never forget. But as a public and political matter, our bear is wearing a smoky hat and carries a shovel to put out fires. Powell then posed the question that American leaders were just beginning to confront. So what does all this mean for us? Remember the old saw, what will all the preachers do when the devil is dead? That same month, the new Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, prepared a speech with a decidedly different outlook. Cheney, who had been White House Chief of Staff under President Gerald R. Ford, and then served 10 years in the House of Representatives, had taken charge of the Pentagon only 2 months earlier. It was a late, hurried appointment, made after the Senate had rejected President George H.W. Bush's first nominee, John Tower. During his first weeks on the job, Cheney had concentrated on learning his way around. En route to his first White House meeting, he got lost in the Pentagon basement. But by May 1989, when the new Defense Secretary was to deliver a speech at a Washington think tank, he was ready to give a detailed exposition of his views. Cheney's views were essentially the opposite of Powell's. There was no need for far-reaching change, he argued in his speech. The Cold War was not over. However genuine the reforms taking place in the Soviet Union, this is not the time to engage in a wholesale reworking of American defense policy, he asserted. He then took a step further, asserting that America would have to play a powerful role in the world even if the Cold War ended. Starting with World War II, he said, the United States had come to take the responsibility for seeing to it that liberty and free government had a congenial home in the world. In other words, our commitment to the exercise of global military power became not just a temporary expedient, but a permanent condition. As it turned out, the 2 speeches had little impact. In fact, Cheney's was never delivered. The White House rejected it as too hawkish. National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft and his staff felt that it might interfere with the ongoing diplomacy with Moscow being pursued by Secretary of State James Baker, so the speech lay in a file, unused. Nor did Powell's speech in Carlisle get a much better reception. It was criticized from the opposite direction, for being too dovish. Scowcroft's deputy, Robert M. Gates, who for years had served as the CIA's leading Soviet analyst, telephoned Powell to say that the general shouldn't have been speaking in such broad terms about the Soviet Union. Senior military figures objected too. They said, "What are you doing? The Soviet Union isn't dead. It's coming back," recalled Lawrence Wilkerson, Powell's speechwriter at the time. The Cheney and Powell speeches are a stark illustration of the divergent viewpoints of these two men who would eventually emerge as leading antagonists at the highest levels of the U.S. government. Over the following 2 decades, at the end of the Cold War and in its immediate aftermath, the United States reached the pinnacle of its power in the world. At first, it was accorded almost universal deference as the sole remaining superpower, a nation that could and did wield its economic and military power at will so as to shape the world in the ways it thought best. Then it overestimated its power, launching costly military ventures that proved spectacularly unsuccessful. After 2 decades, America began to pull back, no longer confident of its success or its power, no longer enjoying the instinctive deference of other nations. Eventually, in the presidency of Donald Trump, it actively cast off its role as leader of the international community. Colin Powell and Dick Cheney were among the leading public figures of the post-Cold War era. They were close partners in the triumphs of the George H.W. Bush administration, riding together in victory parades after the end of the Persian Gulf War. They returned to office again in the George W. Bush administration, this time as adversaries, favoring opposing visions of America's role in the world as the United States embarked on its disastrous invasion of Iraq. In their time, no other figure served so long at the top levels of American foreign policy as did Cheney and Powell. In the 2 decades between 1988 and 2008, Colin Powell served for 9 years under 4 American presidents: Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush, as National Security Advisor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Secretary of State. Over the same period, Dick Cheney served for 12 years as Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush and as Vice President under George W. Bush. Even the 2-term presidents of the post-Cold War era, Clinton, the younger Bush, and Barack Obama, held high office for only 8 years apiece. Cheney and Powell had greater longevity at the top than any of them. Powell was for a time so popular that many felt he could have been president, while Cheney was for a time so powerful that many thought that he was effectively the president. Powell's problem was that he could not find a home or a base in either of America's 2 political parties. He never fit comfortably into either of the 2 visions of U.S. foreign policy that dominated American electoral politics in those times: Democratic liberal internationalism and Republican neoconservatism. Cheney's problem lay elsewhere. He nestled snugly into the Republican Party, but he could never master the public side of electoral politics. Indeed, he seemed almost to revel in his own unpopularity, comforting himself with comparisons to Winston Churchill whenever he found himself abdicating policies deemed unacceptable by the public at large. There was no lack of irony here. Over time, Powell came to think of Cheney and Cheney's longtime associate and patron Donald Rumsfeld as politicians, whereas he, Powell, was not. He never ran for office. Yet Powell was the dynamic figure who could charm the crowds and the press, as Cheney could not. Conversely, Cheney, although he himself held elective office, thought of Powell as the one who was by nature a politician, not a policymaker. Powell was charismatic while Cheney was aloof. Paul Wolfowitz, who worked with both men inside the Pentagon during the George H.W. Bush administration, recalled what happened when he traveled to the Middle East with them at the time of the 1991 Persian Gulf War. Everywhere Powell would go, he was a rock star. The troops loved him and vice versa, and he was good at it, he said. At one refueling stop, Wolfowitz was standing alone with Cheney outside the plane and noticed a small group of soldiers at a fence nearby. Wolfowitz had to walk over and ask, "Would you like to meet the Secretary of Defense?" When the soldier said yes, Cheney ambled over and spoke cordially with them, seeming to enjoy it. But it wasn't his instinct to go do that himself, Wolfowitz observed. Powell would have been there in 2 seconds without prompting. Yet curiously, when it came to public debate on the issues of the day, Cheney often seemed more comfortable operating in the spotlight than Powell. He would state his views out front and forcefully. Powell preferred to operate behind the scenes, meeting with the key decision-makers, seeking to persuade in private rather than in public. After the September 11th attacks, and in the debates that led up to the invasion of Iraq, it was Cheney who thundered in television interviews and speeches to groups such as the Veterans of Foreign Wars. Richard Haas, who worked for Powell at the time, found himself spending less time than he'd expected on speech writing. Colin Powell wasn't inclined to give policy-laden speeches, he later wrote. He much preferred more personal and less formal talks along the lines of those he honed during his years on the speaking circuit. It is wrong to consider the two men lifelong rivals or enemies. On the contrary, only 2 months after their dueling speeches about the Cold War in the spring of 1989, Cheney went out of his way to select Powell as his candidate to serve as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, overcoming initial resistance from the White House. And it was this job that catapulted Powell to his prominence in post-Cold War America. The two men worked extremely closely together throughout George H.W. Bush's administration. Powell and Cheney are remembered now as diminished figures because of the spectacular failure of the invasion of Iraq. Cheney was the most fervent proponent of military action. Powell never resigned or publicly dissented as the George W. Bush administration pursued that war. Yet their early triumphs and subsequent failures are a central part of the American narrative. It was the choices they made, together and separately, that helped set the course for America in the years following the end of the Cold War. For years a question has swirled around these men and the era in which they served. How and why did the country tumble from such optimism at the time of the Persian Gulf War and the collapse of the Soviet Union to the divisions, uncertainty, and diminished confidence that prevailed 2 decades later? For Powell, the question centers on his role as Secretary of State under President George W. Bush. To what extent did he oppose the Iraq War? Did he ever challenge President Bush? Why didn't he resign, or at least air his misgivings? How did he allow himself to be the public spokesman at the United Nations for accusations against Iraq that turned out to be untrue? Was he a lesser figure than he had seemed a decade earlier? Concerning Cheney, the questions and theorizing have become a cottage industry. Above all, they focus on whether Cheney had somehow changed from the early 1990s, when he was widely portrayed as a calm, dispassionate, reasonable Secretary of Defense, to the early 2000s, when he was the truculent, implacable spokesman for conservative policies, above all for American military power and the right and necessity of using it. In the years during and after the Iraq War, many popular explanations were offered for Cheney's behavior. They started with the medical. It was not uncommon to have heard at least second-hand of some cardiologist who claimed to know that Cheney's personality had changed because of his heart attacks or the operations to treat them, and that these changes were what had caused Cheney to become such a war hawk. Other theories centered on his family and friends. Former President George H.W. Bush speculated that Cheney might have changed as a result of the influence of family members, specifically his wife Lynn and his daughter Liz. I've concluded that Lynn Cheney is a lot of the Emmy-nose grease here, iron ass, tough as nails, driving," the elder Bush told his biographer John Meacham. Cheney offered a different explanation, that the world had changed with the September 11th attacks, and that his own thinking and conduct had changed in response to that event. When Brent Scowcroft voiced objections to a prospective war against Iraq, Cheney argued that Scowcroft had a pre-9/11 mindset. "We were at war against terrorist enemies who could not be negotiated with, deterred, or contained, and who would never surrender. This was not the world of superpower tensions and arms control agreements in which Brent had served." A variant of this theory, common among foreign policy specialists, is that it was the anthrax attacks a few weeks after September 11th that solidified Cheney's hardline views. People who watched him said this is what changed him. It was not 9/11. It was the anthrax attacks. The vice president believed that this would be the beginning of a series of use of weapons of mass destruction against the United States, said Andrew Natsios, who served as a State Department aide under Powell. That's when something switched in his mind, and he became much more aggressive, but also darker in his view of what was happening in the world. Far less explored was the possibility that Cheney hadn't changed much at all, that he had always been more conservative and more tenacious than his former colleagues had recognized. What had changed was that as vice president, he had risen to a level of political authority where he could endeavor to put his views into effect. It must be asked finally whether America itself had changed in these 2 decades, from 1988 to 2008. What transpired in the United States and in the rest of the world to create a climate in which Dick Cheney's views would prevail over the principles that had held sway during the Cold War, principles that Colin Powell embraced? How did it happen that Dick Cheney and Colin Powell emerged on the same side of many of the debates that raged in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and on opposing sides in the early 2000s? That is the story this book means to tell. Part 1. Indispensable. 1. Useful Young Men. I would spend nearly 20 years, one way or another, grappling with our experience in this country. And over all that time, Vietnam rarely made much more sense than Captain Hughes' circular reasoning on that January day in 1963. We're here because we're here, because we're... Colin Powell. I was of the opinion that the combination of Vietnam and Watergate had significant negative impact on the presidency and in terms of the balance between Congress and the White House. I thought Congress had infringed on executive prerogatives. Dick Cheney. The early lives of Dick Cheney and Colin Powell possess some surprising similarities. Both men began their careers in the 1960s, when the Vietnam War was the preoccupying issue of the day. Both men began their ascent in Washington during the 1970s, as America struggled with the end of that war and its consequences. As young men, Powell and Cheney gained prominence and were propelled forward, not for their ideas or vision, but because of their skills at the less exalted tasks of organization and administration. Before they were political leaders, they were bureaucrats. Each started as an unusually talented staff aide. Each proved adept at the basic task of getting things done for his bosses. Because of their fundamental competence, both Cheney and Powell attracted powerful, high-level mentors who would promote their careers in Washington for years to come. But these similarities go only so far. Powell grew up in America's biggest city, Cheney in the sparsely populated Mountain West. As he started his career, Powell was always trying to build a record for himself, to find ways in which he could stand out. Cheney, by contrast, was trying to overcome his own record, a police record, a legacy of his occasionally raucous youth. Each time Cheney was offered a new, more powerful job, he would feel compelled to confess to his indiscretions as a young man. Powell was the older of the two, born in 1937, 4 years before Cheney. That age difference meant that Powell was old enough to harbor strong childhood memories of World War II, which the United States entered when he was 4 years old. Cheney could remember only the final year of the war and his father coming home. For Powell, the World War II memories lingered. Decades later, he would sometimes be criticized for wanting to avoid small-scale wars and for seeking to conserve American troops for big wars of the sort that Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley had fought. As a grown man, Powell would be hosted by Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace, dance with Princess Diana, own expensive Manhattan apartments, and become friends with tycoons such as Walter Annenberg. Yet no one ever questioned his humble origins or accused him of elitism. He was born in Harlem, the son of Jamaican immigrants, both of whom worked in the city's garment district. The family eventually moved to the South Bronx, where Powell spent most of his childhood. He chose to go to City College of New York because its tuition was free, whereas New York University, which also accepted him, cost $750 a year. At the prodding of his mother, Powell tried to major in engineering, but quickly found it too hard for him. A professor said to me, "Imagine a plane intersecting a cone in space." I said, "I cannot imagine a plane intersecting a cone in space. I'm out of here," Powell recalled years later. He switched to geology, but soon began devoting most of his energy to another field in which he excelled, the military. He joined the CCNY branch of the Reserve Officers Training Corps, loved it, and eventually became its cadet colonel, commander of the 1,000-man regiment. "The discipline, the structure, the camaraderie, the sense of belonging were what I craved," Powell said. "Race, color, background, income meant nothing." He entered the Army soon after his graduation in 1958. At first he started down the predictable path of a young officer in peacetime, moving from base to base in the United States and Europe. But peace was not to last. In the mid-1950s, France had departed in defeat from its former colonies in Indochina, leaving behind a divided country in Vietnam. Communist North Vietnamese troops and guerrilla forces in the South sought to topple the pro-Western regime in South Vietnam and reunify the country, attracting support from the Soviet Union and China. The United States intervened to prop up the regime in Saigon, citing its Cold War policy of stopping the spread of communism. In the early 1960s, the administration of President John F. Kennedy began dispatching small numbers of American military advisors to South Vietnam. By the end of the decade, more than 500,000 American combat troops would be fighting there. Colin Powell spent 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. The first was in 1962 to 63, the initial phase of the war, as the total American troop presence in Vietnam was being raised from 3,000 to 11,000. At the time, ordinary Americans were so little aware of the country that when Powell first got his orders, his family had to look on a map to see where Vietnam was. Captain Powell served as an advisor to a South Vietnamese battalion far out in the jungle of the Ah Chau Valley, near the border with Laos, amid the insects, leeches, and Viet Cong guerrillas. He once went a month without bathing, except for a quick splash in a stream. After 6 months there, spent largely on his own with the South Vietnamese troops, and frequently under fire, he was wounded when he stepped on a poison spike that went straight through his foot. He returned home from that tour with a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. 5 years later, Powell was sent back, this time at the height of the war, at a time when the morale of the American troops was flagging. Powell, now a major, served as executive officer of the U.S. Army's Americal Division and as its staff officer for operations and planning. During this second tour, the helicopter in which he was riding crashed. He suffered a broken ankle, but managed to drag his commanding officer to safety. He was awarded a Legion of Merit. The war turned out to be far costlier than America could tolerate. Younger Americans whose frame of reference is the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 can scarcely imagine how much greater an impact the Vietnam War had on American lives, society, politics, the armed forces, foreign policy, intellectual life, and culture. More than 58,000 Americans were killed, nearly 12 times as many as in the Iraq War. By 1973, the United States had withdrawn all its forces. 2 years later, the South Vietnamese regime collapsed. His Vietnam experience left Powell with a profound, instinctive mistrust of experts, abstractions, and technocratic solutions of the sort that officials in Washington had concocted to justify what turned out to be a futile military action. Powell had experienced the war up close, and he was convinced that the top U.S. political and military leaders in Washington had not understood the reality on the ground in Vietnam. In harboring such sentiments, he was hardly unique. Millions of other Americans reacted to the war in the same way. But for Powell, Vietnam also amplified the anti-intellectual tendencies he had already harbored earlier in his life. He belittled slide rule prodigies such as Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who had regularly proclaimed that America was winning the war. Deep thinkers were producing printouts, filling spreadsheets, crunching numbers, and coming out with blinding flashes of the obvious, while an enemy in black pajamas and Firestone flip-flops could put an officer out of the war with a piece of bamboo dripped in manure, he later wrote. Experts often produce more data than judgment. The war also left Powell with a sense of anger at the injustices of the military draft. Young men from wealthy or middle-class backgrounds received draft deferments, while the poorer and less educated were shipped off to Vietnam. Among the millions who obtained deferments was a young man from Wyoming named Dick Cheney. Powell disparaged the way America was fighting a war for which it had little enthusiasm. "We were in a war against an enemy who believed in his cause and was willing to pay the price, however high," he later wrote. For all these reasons, Powell developed strong views about the ways America should and should not go into battle. The United States should not have gone into a half-hearted half-war in Vietnam, he later wrote. War should be politics of last resort, he argued, and the United States should go to war only with strong public support. But once America did go to war, it should set clear goals, mobilize its resources, and go in to win. Over the following 3 decades, Powell would repeatedly find himself confronting these same questions about how and when America should go to war. He would play a role in the creation of new guidelines for American policymakers, seeking to ensure that America never again fought a military conflict the way it had in Vietnam. Dick Cheney's childhood was, if anything, too stable, instilling a desire for movement, upheaval, and disorder. His father's parents had wandered around the Great Plains, their lives subject to the vicissitudes of drought, recessions, and bank failures. Seeking to avoid a similar fate, his father took a job with the U.S. Soil Conservation Service, held it for 3 decades, settled in Wyoming, and was pleased to retire on a federal pension. Cheney grew up in Casper, where he was an all-state football star at Natrona County High School, served as president of the student council, and began to date his future wife, Lynn Vincent, the state champion baton twirler. He was very popular, very involved, and smart, but he's never been the kind of smart that is flashy, said Dave Gribben, who went to high school with Cheney and later worked for him. After graduating from high school in 1959, Cheney began a period of instability, insobriety, and intermittent wildness that lasted for several years. Most of his fellow graduates went on to the University of Wyoming or to nearby Casper College, but a Yale alumnus living in Wyoming had encouraged Cheney to apply to his alma mater. At the time, Yale's student body was composed mostly of students from the Northeast, often from elite schools. The active recruitment of public high school graduates from states such as Wyoming was part of an effort to expand Yale's geographical diversity. Cheney won admission and entered Yale, but he soon discovered that he didn't fit in, except with a small group of friends who, in his own words, shared my belief that beer was one of the essentials of life. At the end of his freshman year, the Yale administration asked him to take a year off. He did, but after returning, he continued to receive poor grades and disciplinary warnings, and finally dropped out of Yale again, this time permanently. Returning west, Cheney went to work as a lineman, stringing cable and power lines and operating equipment for construction crews as he moved from job to job in Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. He lived in roadside motels and unwound at night in local watering holes, drinking beer, sometimes with shots of bourbon. He was arrested for drunk driving in late 1962 and again less than a year later. On the second occasion, he woke up with a hangover in jail. By Cheney's own account, this was something of a conversion experience. He decided to stay away from the bars and to go back to school. He returned to college at the University of Wyoming, mostly because he was a resident of the state, and thus the university was obliged to accept him despite his poor grades. There he turned into a serious student. To some extent, the demeanor and effect for which Cheney would be known later in life, the deep voice, the cool assurance, the extreme gravity and sobriety, the aura that everything has been foreseen and is under control, can be viewed as a reaction to this chaotic period in his youth. The arrests for drunk driving became a record he felt compelled to explain at various stages in his life. When he was being considered for a top job in the White House during the administration of Gerald Ford, Cheney disclosed the arrests, saying he didn't want the president to be surprised. The issue went to Ford himself, who ordered that Cheney be hired. A quarter-century later, when George W. Bush offered him the vice presidency in the summer of 2000, Cheney again felt obliged to confess to Bush and his political advisor Karl Rove the drunk driving episodes of his youth. At the time, Cheney did not know that Bush was concealing a similar arrest in his own past, one that would become public just before Election Day. Cheney finished his undergraduate degree.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?